Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. On today's show, it is time for my start, sits, and sleepers for Week 14 of the fantasy football season. It is likely either the last week of your regular season or the second last week, depending on how your playoff format is set up. Either way, it's a crucial week of games. I hope you have a lot of success this week. Last week on the show, I went 14-12 on my picks. I'm up to 186 and 152 for the season in my picks. So not doing too shabby. Hopefully I can build on last week where I had a decent week winning 14 of my picks. And as always, I'm going to give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper at QB, running back, and receiver. And I'll give you 2 tight ends, starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper at that position as well. Also, we have 4 teams on a bye this week. That's not an optimal thing because we have a couple really good players off, including Christian McCaffrey. Just keep that in mind when you're setting your lineups this week, and hopefully they don't impact you too bad, the bye weeks this week. But if they do, hopefully those players you are subbing in can produce well for you this week. Maybe they'll make my list for my start, sits, and sleepers, hopefully the starts. And we're going to always, as always, we'll start with the quarterback position for the show. And I'll give you 3 starts. My first one is Trevor Lawrence of the Jags. He is 7th overall in fantasy quarterback scoring his last 3 games. He has 23-plus fantasy points, 2 straight games. He finally has all his weapons back. He has Jacoby Myers now in the mix after they traded for him, and they have a really good rapport. So Lawrence is kind of firing on all cylinders right now, and he gets the Colts this week. They're middle of the pack against the pass, and they have some injuries in the secondary, including shutdown corner Sauce Gardner. So that's a huge loss for them. Colts have allowed 250-plus passing yards 2 straight games. I look for Lawrence to keep it going this week. My next start at QB is Jared Goff of the Lions. He's kind of been all over the map this year, more so than you would like, but he's played better lately. He has 20-plus fantasy points 2 straight and 4 or 5 games. I know Amon-Ra St. Brown's likely out this week, but I think the Lions are going to need to throw the ball to move the ball on the Cowboys defense. That front 4 is pretty good for Dallas, but the secondary still has some issues. They allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So I think Goff is going to have to air it out if this Lions team hopes to produce big in Week 14. My next start at quarterback is Jordan Love of the Packers. Just a huge game last week, 4 touchdown passes. He looked great in that game. He's been kind of all over the map this season, though, but he has had plenty of big games throughout the year, and he has crazy good numbers in December. I had to look this up because I heard about it when I was on the radio this past week on Sirius XM Fantasy Radio. They were talking about how Jordan Love is the December to remember Jordan Love, and he has 16 passing touchdowns to just 1 interception in December throughout his career. So I think he keeps it going this week against the Bears. They allow the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So I think Jordan Love is going to kick off his December on a high note. Now for my sits at quarterback. My first one, it's really tough to sit him, but I would just temper my expectations for Patrick Mahomes this week. And it has nothing to do with anything that he's doing personally. It's his opponent. It's Houston. They have been absolutely dominant defensively. They have allowed less than 200 passing yards in a game every game since week 3. The most passing yards they have given up all season, that came in week 1 to the Rams, and it was just 224 passing yards. They allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. They give up just 14.7 fantasy points to quarterbacks per game. So I would expect Mahomes to have a ho-hum showing for him this week. Nothing spectacular. I don't think he's going to go off in this matchup. It's a really tough one for him. My next sit at quarterback is Marcus Mariota of the Washington Commanders. He had his best fantasy game of the season last week, 27.2 fantasy points. He has 3 games this year with 20-plus fantasy points, but he's still a matchup play in my opinion. You can't just plug and play him in that Commanders offense. He gets the Vikings this week. Not a great matchup for him. Allowed less than 185 passing yards 4 straight games, and they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So I wouldn't get too high on Mariota over last week. I still think he's a matchup play, and Week 14 is not a matchup to use him. My last sit at quarterback, Sam Darnold of the Seahawks. You have to love his matchup this week against a reeling Falcons defense. but I just don't trust him at this time of the year. He has just 5.4 fantasy. He had just 5.4 fantasy points last week. Just an awful game from a fantasy perspective. And he has fewer than 12 fantasy points 3 of his last 4 games. Those are terrible fantasy numbers. I just don't want any part of him at this crucial time of the year for fantasy teams. I would steer clear of him, even though I really like his matchup against Atlanta. My sleeper quarterback is rookie Tyler Shugg of the New Orleans Saints. He is actually 11th overall in fantasy quarterback scoring his last 3 games. He has 21 plus fantasy points 2 of those 3 games. He's starting to play some good football, producing some solid numbers, and he gets the Bucs this week. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. They're going to have to throw the ball to keep up with this offense in Tampa. And the Bucs also allow the 3rd most fantasy points quarterbacks on the season. So I think Shugg could be a good sneaky play for fantasy teams. Moving on to running back now, I'll give you my starts to start off, and it starts with Chase Brown of the Bengals. He had a slow start to the year. A lot of people were disappointed with him. He's really picked up his play lately, though. He has more than 100 total yards, 6 straight games, 15 plus fantasy points, 5 straight games. He is 8th overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He gets the Bills. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points of running backs on the season. They gave up 100, and they have given up 195 plus rushing yards 2 or 4 games. I think Brown is a great play in this one. My next start at running back is actually a combination of Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason. Jones has a shoulder injury, so he's kind of up in the air. They're calling him day to day. We should know more as the week progresses, but if he starts, I like him a lot this week. Minnesota is just a disaster throwing the ball right now. I don't know who's going to start at quarterback for them, but whoever it is, they haven't been very good lately. And I think they're going to focus on running the ball with each of these backs against Washington. They allow the 4th most fantasy points of running backs on the season. They've given up 145 plus rushing yards, 6 of 8 games. So if Jones starts, I would feel very good playing him. If Mason ends up being the guy that starts, I would be really intrigued by playing him as well. I think either back that starts in this matchup is going to do well. My next start at running back is Omarion Hampton of the Chargers. He's expected to return this week. It's not official yet. Again, we should know more as the week progresses, but I think he returns. And if he doesn't, Kamani Vidal is a great start as well, especially with Justin Herbert iffy to play. He had surgery on his hand, his wrist on Monday, so we don't know his status yet, but I think they're going to lean on the run either way. Vidal ran the ball 25 times last week for a season-high 126 yards. Whoever's playing is going to get a ton of work against this Eagles defense that allows the 7th most fantasy points of running backs. They could not stop the Bears on the ground at all last week, gave up 281 rushing yards in that game. So I really like Hampton if he starts, and if Vidal has to start another matchup, another game this week, because Hampton's still not ready to go, I like him as well. My sits at running back. My first one's Ashton Jeanty of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's getting a lot of touches, which is a good thing, but not many yards. He has fewer than 65 rushing yards 6 straight games. The only thing that's really saving his fantasy value right now is his work in the passing game. He has at least 5 receptions, 4 or 5 games, but I'm just not sure he gets it going this week against Denver. A great defense. They held him in check. His last meeting, he had just 63 total yards, despite getting 22 touches. The only thing that saved him in that matchup was the touchdown he scored, but I'm not sure he scores this week against the Broncos. The Broncos held the Raiders to just 7 points in week 10. They've allowed less than 20 points 3 or 4 games. Denver also allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs on the season. Jeanty's a bit of a scary play, in my opinion. My next sit is kind of a guy that's like Omarion Hampton. He's expected to return this week after missing a lot of time, and it's Trey Benson. I think he's back this week, which is good news for that running game, but remember, he had double-digit fantasy points just 1 of the 4 games he has played this year. So he's not a sure thing by any means, especially in his first game back from injury, and he gets a tough matchup to start his return to the lineup, and it's against the Rams. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points of running backs. I know the Panthers kind of ran all over the Rams last week, but that was really kind of out of the norm for this defense. This defense has actually been really good against the run most of the year. They've allowed fewer than 100 rushing yards 6 times this season. My last sit at running back is Woody Marks of the Texans. He's getting a lot of work, but he just hasn't produced much of late. He's clearly the lead back now in this offense, but he has less than 9 fantasy points 3 straight games. He does have 17 plus total touches all of those games, which is the positive, but the negative is he's just not getting much done with that work. And I think it could be more of the same this week against the Chiefs. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points of running backs, less than 100 rushing yards allowed, 5 of 7 games as well. My sleeper at running back, it is Devin Neal of the Saints. So he started last week, which was the positive, and he played 82% of the snaps. So he was the clear lead back. He had 17 touches in the game. He didn't do much with those touches, but if he gets that workload again this week in a starting role against the Bucs, I think he could do well. I know Tampa kind of limits the rushing yards, but they have struggles against stopping backs out of the backfield, and they've given up some rushing touchdowns as well this year. So I think Neal could be a good play in this matchup, especially if he gets that amount of work. My receiver start, sits, and sleepers. We'll go with the starts. And my first one is Jameson Williams. He's set to take over as the number 1 receiver for the Lions with Amon-Ra St. Brown expected to miss some time. I know they're holding out hope he could play this week. It looked like a pretty serious ankle injury, though, so I would not expect him back this week. You never know. It's tough not to rule him out. But even if he plays, I still think Williams is a great play in this matchup. He is a much healthier receiver of the two, and he's coming off his best game of the season, 7 catches, 144 yards, and a touchdown on 10 targets. He showed he could be an explosive receiver as the number 1 option in this offense, and he gets the Cowboys this week. They allow the most fantasy points to receivers on the season. I think Williams is set up for a smash game in week 14. My next start at receivers, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. He's really picked up his game lately. He is 10th overall in fantasy receiver scoring his last 3 games. He was targeted a season high 10 times this past week. He has 18 plus fantasy points, 2 of 3 games. I think he's emerging in a crowded receiver room as the top target for the Packers and Jordan Love. I already mentioned I like Love this week, and I like him because of that matchup against the Bears, so I like Watson as well. They allowed the 8th most fantasy points to receivers. I think Watson's going to keep up his hot ways in this one. My last start at receiver, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He needs to get it going. This whole offense does, but Flowers does as well, so I think they're going to find ways to get him the ball this week. He had a terrible game last week in a favorable matchup. But before that, he had double-digit fantasy points 5 straight games before last week. I like him to rebound against the Steelers. They're playing better defensively, but they still allow the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers. They can have some issues stopping the pass, and I think Flowers is going to produce well in this matchup. My sits at receiver, my first one's Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. Smith's starting to cool off a little bit with A.J. Brown getting so much work lately. Smith has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He had a great matchup last week, but he couldn't do much with it. And he gets a tougher matchup this week against the Chargers. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to receivers and given up less than 155 passing yards 5 straight games. So they've really done a great job at limiting the pass. My next sit at receiver is Jaden Higgins of the Texans. So the Texans, you can see, I'm kind of out on their offense this week. I've listed several of their players in this as sits, and Jaden Higgins is my next one. He has emerged as a legit number 2 receiver for the Texans, which is a good thing. He has 11 plus fantasy points, 3 or 4 games, but he still has disappeared at times this year. So he's not a sure thing in my opinion. He has 5 games with a reception or less, and he gets the Chiefs. They've allowed fewer than 200 passing yards 6 times this year. And I think it's going to be a low scoring affair against Kansas City this week. 2 good defensive teams that I think could shut down the opposing offense. And I'm going to give you another player in this matchup I don't like, and it's Xavier Worthy of the Chiefs. I liked him last week. I put him on my start list. He came through, but I don't think he's going to do it again this week. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 3 straight games before that game last week, and he gets attacking the Texans, as I mentioned. Really good pass defense, allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points receivers on the season. Worthy's a scary play. I think if you're going to play any of the Chiefs options in the passing game, it's Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. I would steer clear of everybody else. My sleeper at receiver, it's Pat Bryant of the Denver Broncos. Bryant had a season-high 7 targets last week. He didn't do a whole lot with those, but I'm really encouraged by the workload. Caught 3 passes for 42 yards. He's forming a good rapport with Bo Nix. He has 13 targets his last 2 games. He gets the Raiders. They allow the third most fantasy points to receivers. Brian had a 43-yard reception against the Raiders in week 10. Maybe he gets a couple of those this week and produces a big game for his fantasy owners. All right, I'll give you my tight end start, sits, and sleepers now. My starts. My first one's Tyler Warren of the Colts. He's really pretty much a must start no matter the week, the game, the matchup, you name it. But I really like him this week. He found the end zone last week, caught 3 passes for 22 yards. His yardage totals were held down again, though, but his touchdown made up for that. He has double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He's 4th overall in fantasy tight end scoring for the season. He gets a Jags. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends this year. I think Warren could do really well in this one. All right, I'll give you the other tight end in this game as my other start, and it's Brenton Strange of the Jaguars. He's looked great since his return from injury, 13-plus fantasy points, 2 straight games, 8 catches for 138 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets in those 2 games. He gets the Colts, another team that struggles to stop the tight end. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends. And as I mentioned earlier, with Trevor Lawrence, they've allowed 250-plus passing yards 2 straight games. They have some injuries in the secondary. I think Brenton Strange could take advantage and continue his hot ways. My sits at tight end. My first one's Mike Gesicki of the Bengals. He returned in week 12, and he has 6 catches for 54 yards on 10 targets his last 2 games. He is the top tight end in this offense. He's getting some good looks, but I think he's still more of a matchup play. You can't just throw him in your lineup, and I don't like his matchup at all this week against Buffalo. They're great against the tight end. They allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season, so this is not a week to use Gesicki, despite the 4 teams being on a bye, and you might be kind of short at the position. I'd steer clear of Gesicki. My last sit at tight ends, Colston Loveland of the Bears. He has emerged as the starting tight end for the Bears, but his numbers have still been a little erratic in that role. Less than double-digit fantasy points, 3-4 games. He gets a Packers team this week that's allowed less than 200 passing yards 4 or 5 games. I don't think Loveland's going to do much in this matchup. Could be another disappointing day, finishing with fewer than double-digit fantasy points. My sleeper at tight end, it is A.J. Barner of the Seahawks. I said I didn't like Sam Darnold this week, but I still think he could throw for some yards, and I think Barner could be targeted in this matchup. He has been the top tight end for the Seahawks. He played 85% of the snaps last week. He had 4 catches on 5 targets in that game. He has double-digit fantasy points, 6 of 12 games this year. He's shown he's a good spot play in the right matchup, and as I mentioned, I like the matchup against Atlanta. Good time to use him. Atlanta has really been leaky against the pass in recent weeks. They gave up more than 400-plus passing yards to the Panthers in Week 11. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for the crucial Week 14 slate of games. Hopefully you have a lot of success this week. Come out on top in all your games. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.